Hello, this is Storybooks channel. New videos are posted every day. Subscribe and click the bell.
The alarm clock ruthlessly broke the morning silence. Julia opened her eyes with difficulty, reached for it, and slammed the not friend button with relish. I'm going to sleep. But not 5 minutes later, a subdued mother peeked into the room. What are you, breathing to school about sleeping? You have a test on geography in the first lesson. I told you yesterday, she shouted, and then came to the bed and unceremoniously yanked the blanket off her daughter. Get up, lazybones. God, what kind of punishment is this? And in whom are you so lazy? Exactly like your bad father. Helen would be twice as good as her sister. Oh, that's it. I'm already late. Come on, get in line. I gotta get in line. Shouted all this mother rushed out of the room, and a minute later the front door slammed and left, and Julia lay with her eyes open. Suddenly wanted to sleep only from the hurtful words. Mother wanted to cry. She's lazy, isn't Julia? Mother had sat outside the department store half the night last night and sent to be among the first in line for the next transportation. She couldn't do it herself. She had a headache. Julia was third. She had to wait for 2 hours. As another midnight approached, Julia got home around 3 a.m. It was now 8 o'clock. Yes, there's a test today. I didn't want to go to the test, but there's nothing to do. Otherwise, if her mother finds out, it'll be worse. Maybe she'll towel us down. We rather splashed in the face with cold water from the tap. Julia ran to the kitchen, bread sprinkled with sugar. The best breakfast ever, almost brownies. Julia ate it with pleasure, drinking slightly warm water, and then pulling on an old-school uniform, ran out of the house, taking a worn briefcase. Everything was so simple and very sad, and even scary. After all, it was the early 90s. The whole country was in shock. Everything had collapsed. People hadn't been paid for months. Empty store shelves only occasionally threw something away. But to do that you had to stand in a huge queue, which was occupied from nightfall, like Julia. That time, Julia is an ordinary girl. For 14 years, she lived with her mom and her sister, a student. A year ago, a terrible tragedy happened in their family. Father, left unemployed after being downsized at work, could think of nothing better. Like climbing into a noose. Julia found him in the garage, where she came running to call for dinner. From the horror of the girl came to herself for several months. Before her eyes stood her father, who loved her more than anything else in the world. Why did he do that? Why did he abandon her mom and sister? Apparently out of desperation, out of hopelessness. And it was his mom who drove him to it. Her constant tantrums, reproaches did their job. At such a difficult time to be unemployed. Go be a janitor, a loader. Cindy screamed. The others are working and nothing. I can't be a loader. Tiredly answered the father. I'm a scientist, Cindy. We have nothing to eat. The scientist exclaimed angrily to his wife. Soon we'll all die, and you still cared about him. So he found a way to solve all the problems. And Julia loved her father very much. They had such a trusting relationship. As something half a year before the dismissal, father brought from work beads, beautiful amber beads for some part-time work. Father was paid with this jewelry, and he gave beads Julia. Real amber winked. He said to his daughter, you take care of them. And we'll tell mom it's a plastic pacifier. If she guesses, Julia was confused, clutching the gift to her chest. She won't, he smiled. She's not good at this. And indeed, Cindy decided that Julia had gotten simple costume jewelry. And Helen, the sister, didn't pay attention to the jewelry either. She couldn't believe her father would give her something. Expensive, not to her. Smart and beautiful. And Julia, the ugly duckling. Julia kept these beads as the apple of her eye, did not wear them anywhere. They just lay in her nightstand in a cardboard box of vitamins. And when her father was gone, the girl never parted with them, as brushes with them, sat with them constantly, both at home and at school. Not her mother, not her sister, didn't try to take them away from her. Let her sit, if it makes her feel better. And then the pain slowly went away. Maybe the beads helped, and they moved back to the nightstand. Julia's psyche recovered from the shock, and the girl went on with her life. And then Helen struck. She was going to a student party, and she really needed a piece of jewelry to Limonov color blouse, which she was bought by her mother's blat. Then Helen remembered about costume jewelry, as she thought that her younger sister Julia was just at school drawing a wall newspaper for Christmas. And Helen had put on the cleats without asking. She liked the result. And you would not think that cheap, as if real jewelry. The girl marveled and Cindy nodded at her. It's not bad at all. And at the party Helen was having so much fun, dancing heartily, and at some point sharply jerked his hand, fixing her hair and rolled yellow stones. Who went where? The girl, thinking that they were trinkets, worthless, was not particularly upset. Just stuck the rest of the jewelry on the torn threads in her pocket and continued to have fun. And the next day Julia, when hanging up her sister's skirt in the closet, found her beads, or rather what was left of them. Oh, how she cried. Why did you take them? She shouted at her sister. That's mine. My father gave it to me. Oh my God. What are you worrying about? My sister sincerely didn't understand. It's so cheap. Don't you understand anything? Julia screamed. It's mine. You understand? It's mine. Cindy came in and quickly quieted her youngest daughter. Nothing here is yours, shouted she and raged. Don't you dare yell at your sister. She's the eldest, but she took those beads. So what? You're gonna throw them away. Stop hurting yourself. Dad gave it to me. Your dad's a bastard. He left me alone with 2 kids. Cindy spent a lot of time yelling about how bad her husband was. Julia decided not to contradict her, just hid the rest of the beads away so that there would be something left. That night, when her mother and sister were asleep, she took a thin fishing line and put the remaining beads on it. And now she had a bracelet. Julia never parted with this bracelet. She even carried it in her briefcase to school, so as not to attract anyone's attention. Julia often wondered why her mother took Helen's side in all disputes. She's an adult, studying at the institute, and Julia is a child. But invariably Helen was always right. The answer was simple. Only Julia didn't know it. Turns out Cindy didn't want to have a second child. Her husband insisted. So she had one on her own. And then the country's a mess, empty store shelves. And for some reason, they were living modestly. Cindy blamed Julia. If she'd had Helen alone, life would have been so much easier. Sometimes Cindy hated her youngest wild one. Yes, she hated the whole world at times. She could hardly go to her job, though she had a job like no other humanity. Cindy was a midwife at the city maternity hospital. Not from her duty, she performed clearly, unmistakably. But sometimes she was so annoyed by these women who just couldn't get enough of it. They give birth and give birth. In the country of diapers, there is no soap, household soap, you will not find the first time in the stores. Not all give birth and rejoice in this dubious happiness. That's what Cindy thought. But she kept all her thoughts to herself. At work, she was generally restrained. But at home, Julia was torn at her youngest daughter and cleaned the house and cooked as she could on occasion. And on the errand was at her mother-well. She had a docile nature. Yesterday, Cindy told her to go and get in line at the department store, and she did. True, Cindy promised Julia new pantyhose, which were to be thrown out in this transportation by the girl, and ran rushing into the depths. Promised does not mean that she bought it for her. And so Julia, having spent half the night at the store, was on her way to school. She was terribly sleepy, and only the thought that she would soon have new pantyhose gave her strength. Julia already imagined how she would wear them on the evening at school. And that pesky geography, the pre-pod, as promised, gave a control from the first minutes of the lesson. Noticing that the girl is more pecking her nose than writing on a sheet of paper, pushed her to the side. Do not sleep, froze, he whispered. Nodded Julia and tried desperately to hide the girlishness. Focusing on the question, Julia remembered something and started to write, but the thoughts had already fled from her bright head at the speed of light. Mike, looking at the neighbor's desperate attempts, wrote something on a piece of paper and carefully slipped it under Julia's hand. They were short answers to Julia's version. Mike was doing great. He loved geography. That's why it was not a problem for him to write 2 versions of the test for the lesson. Mike dreamed of becoming a geologist and studied natural sciences with special zeal. Julia didn't know yet what she wanted to be. She just studied well, and that's all. But that morning she was sleepy. "What did you do all night?" Mike jokingly asked her in the corridor when, after the test, they were standing in the recess under the physics room. "You sleep on the go. Pantyhose guarded," Julia answered him in tone. "Przewozki department store," Mike specified businesslike. "I see. You tell your grandmother, maybe she needs something. Let her go in case she gets something." The children talked calmly about the deficit. They didn't feel uncomfortable about the situation. It was just a time of scarcity. Mike grew up with his grandmother. Why did he want to be a geologist? He wanted to follow in his parents' footsteps. They were geologists and they died on an expedition. So Grandma Wendy raised him ever since. He and Julia Mike were best friends. They'd been sitting at the same desk since first grade. Mike protected Julia from all the offenders, faithfully carried her satchel. When Julia's father died, he tried his best to comfort his girlfriend. And now at the age of 14, their relationship had reached a new level. Their first love was budding between them. They didn't even know what it was yet. They just wanted to be there for each other all the time. By the third lesson, Julia seemed to want to sleep, and she normally sat up to the end of the school day, and home just flew. Mike could barely keep up with her. "Did you take some jet fuel?" Catching up, he asked. "You're writing." "I really do," she smiled. Julia remembered the shopping. Mom must be home by now. Cindy was already in the hallway when Julia came in. The girl looked at her mother questioningly. She had finished school. She asked her mother indifferently, "Do your homework quietly." "Mom, did you buy me anything for you?" Cindy was sincerely surprised. "Why? There wasn't anything for you. Just for Helen." Julia saw Helen in a new skirt in front of the mirror in the room. On the couch lay a new pack of pantyhose, the kind she had dreamed of as a girl. She walked over and quickly reached for them. "Don't touch them," sharply shouted Helen. "These are mine and mine. I need a mom too. I was in line." "Well done for occupying the Russians," replied Cindy. "Tie your scarf. For a sister, you could have stood." The woman sighed, looked at her reflection. She adjusted the new blouse she had bought today. Then she looked at Julia. "Why are you pouting? Like a toad?" Cindy grinned. "When you grow up, you'll have everything. Until then, your sister's things will be enough for you." "Well, I'm going to take over the house for the shift," and she opened the front door. Julia's lips quivered with resentment. She tried so hard. And what happened? The girl rushed to her room. Why did her mother hurt her so much? If only Daddy were alive. Julia cried. All alone in the world. She came into the room. "Helen is laughing," her sister laughed. "Look what I'll give you." And she pulled out from the top shelf and plywood a blue blouse. An old one with a silly cutout on the chest. "Here, you wear it," her sister told her solemnly. "Only give it back and it will be as good as new." And she did not care at all that this blouse was a couple of sizes too big. Julia gave it to her as a gift. Julia nodded indifferently. Sister expected more emotional gratitude, so she was a little surprised. The little girl is turning her nose up at her. To hell with her. Helen left to get ready. For her date. She just met such a great guy. 2 years passed in the country was still not clear and calm. But little by little began to appear goods. Foreign packaging, things, some outlandish products. Strange words on t-shirts and t-shirts. A lot of people suddenly started selling. It was all buy and sell. Julia was already 16 years old. Enrollment was coming up. The girl was preparing responsibly. She dreamed of going to university and leaving the city. How to live in the capital. On what she had not yet decided. She thought she would work and study. There wasn't much hope for her mother. She still paid all her attention to Helen, who was to graduate from the institute this year. Julia had already resigned herself to it and was almost not offended. But if her mother didn't like her, she couldn't help it. Mike also planned to go to the capital. He and Julia had more and more common interests, and their feelings did not go away, they only grew stronger. And then Helen abruptly got married. A few months ago, she met another suitor. Alex seemed to be a very promising young man. He had a spot in the market where he sold jeans and other clothes. Cindy liked a future son-in-law of such acumen, and always came to their home with gifts. So when he talked about the wedding, she immediately supported her daughter. As long as he calls, we must go. And it is not a problem that a head of the defense of the diploma in the Pedagogical Institute shall pass somehow. And husbands like Alex are not off the hook, not like her dead loser husband. Helen would be like a stone wall behind Alex. Julia was also happy that her sister was getting married. Now the room they shared with Helen would be at her disposal. She also hoped that her mother would pay more attention to her. Maybe she would even love her. Soon the wedding was played, and Helen moved to Alexei. Julia's expectation that her mother would suddenly have feelings for her was not justified. Cindy still lived only the eldest daughter, often went to the young to visit and called Helen. And Julia was still fetch and serve, but Julia swallowed her resentment again. All the more she had her own secret now. When her mother wasn't home, Mike visited her more and more often. They did homework together, watched TV together. They were drawn to each other more and more, but they were still almost children. Each of them was hesitant to take the first step. They didn't even kiss, just good friends. Then Mike got up the nerve to put his arms around Julia and kissed her. Gently, ineffectively, she kissed him back. Then there was another night and another. And one spring evening, they had a real grown-up thing going on. They were both confused about what they had done and at the same time justified themselves. There's a real feeling between them. That's love. We are now forever together, whispered Julia, holding Mishka's forever favorite. The boy answered her, and on the street, the spring was noisy. Everything was buzzing and blooming, and everything wanted to live and love. And ahead, it seemed, only happiness awaited. But disaster struck. Mike, after studying, worked in a small store as a loader and saved up for his dream to buy a motorcycle. And one day he was able to buy it. Not a new one, of course, but the previous owner assured that the machine was a beast. Mike had gotten his license by then. What did he do to appease his grandmother? Wendy's grandmother decided that since the kid was a scientist, he could drive. And Mike rode, and Julia sometimes rode. No, he was careful. He rode by the rules. That summer evening, they agreed to take Julia for a ride out of town to celebrate the end of 10th grade. The girl's mother was at work. Wendy's grandmother was going to bed. No one could stop them. Mike lived 2 blocks away from Julia. She stepped out of the driveway and waited. Suddenly, in the distance, she heard a terrible screech of brakes. Some kind of impact. Then there was the screaming of people. For some reason, Julia immediately realized that Mishka was in trouble. She ran to the noise. Mike was lying on the road in a pool of blood. He had been thrown far away from the motorcycle, which was soon lying at the wheel of a huge dump truck. As it turned out later, the driver of the truck was under a degree and flew without observing any rules. And Mike, who was driving on the main road without exceeding the speed limit, did not even expect such a thing. The truck took a sharp turn out of the corner, and then the impact and Mike was gone. The guys buried him in a closed casket. His body was badly damaged in the accident. Julia, who stood among her classmates, couldn't remember herself. Everything swam away before her eyes. It was unbelievable that Mike was gone. Pain clenched, chest wanted to scream with grief, and only seeing how worried at the coffin old grandmother Wendy. Julia held on. Grandmothers are 1,000 times worse now. First, she buried her son, now her grandson. The summer passed like a blur. Julia went to the store, did things around the house, ran errands for her mother, but her thoughts were far away with Mishka. It was the second terrible loss in the girl's life. Her father was now her favorite. She took out the rest of the beads again, now a bracelet. She sat and pored over the shoes for hours, remembering the time she spent with her beloved. Mike, by the way, and noble this bracelet made for the wall of the hall, and a few more beads, simple, already in a lank blue-white, which the grandmother found, and from this bracelet played all the colors. Julia wiped her tears, remembering Mike's words. Julia, you're a geologist. I'll find the most beautiful emerald and give it to you. Now nothing will do. The girl wept bitterly. Cindy, knowing that her daughter had lost her friend, her first love, she just waved her hand. She'll get over it. How many more will there be? By the fall, Julia suddenly felt ill, nauseous in the morning. She felt dizzy. The girl was pierced by a hunch, and she rushed to the calendar, and then became pale as a canvas. She had lost track of time in the midst of all her worries. She hadn't paid any attention to her own well-being. And it turns out that she has a delayed 4th month. She will have a child, Mike, a child. After a little stupor, the girl came to her senses. She went to the mirror. "My little one," whispered she lifting a little t-shirt, stroking, flat, and still tummy. "My baby," and did not notice Julia, as in the open door at her mother looked from the therapist. "What are you doing?" Cindy whispered, with a jerk, opening the door in notice or something. "No, what are you?" Julia blushed and pulled off her t-shirt. "Just imagining it." "What are you imagining?" Cindy screamed hysterically. "As in Podol you bring me." "Admit it, who's the father?" "Mike is yours." And if so suddenly threw off her head and declared Julia, "It's my baby, and I'm going to have it." "So really pregnant?" Cindy said with a sigh and collapsed into the chair. Then she spoke to her daughter Julia in a surprisingly calm manner. "But you have to do something. You're 17 years old. No, you can't do this. You're in your senior year at university. You dreamed of going. What did you want to be? A translator. You'll get in. Just do as I say now. Tomorrow we'll go to our doctor's office and have him take a look. It's a long time ago." "No, why did you wait?" "I'm good." Only the midwife laughs. "I didn't notice the pregnancy in my daughter." "Well, we'll manage. We'll think of something. I'm not doing anything." "Trembled your voice," replied Julia, realizing that now there will be a storm, and it began. What the mother shouted, how she did not insult her, even slapped Julia. But the girl stood her ground. She would not interrupt. And then Cindy decided to go on the sleigh, lured her daughter to the doctor, and they're already with him and agree. She told her daughter the right drug before the due date. She didn't know, and it was very dangerous. Though I don't like Julia, but she's still my darling. Oh, how I'm screaming. Mother waved her hand. It's your life. You want to be a single mother all your life, be a single mother. And you won't get any education, and you'll work under a dumpster all your life. But you'll have a child with your beloved. Julia, what are you doing? All right, so be it. But I still need to see a doctor. Let's go to our Miranda. She's a good doctor. Mom was actually a regular doctor. She just did a lot of abortions. Of course, Cindy didn't tell her daughter that. Figured Julia wasn't going anywhere. What do we do for her at school? Yes, you scrape afterward. Julia looked at her mom with surprise. Why such a dramatic change? She decided that she had come to terms with it. Mom understood her daughter. In the morning, the two of them went to the hospital. Cindy is back in the ward, having asked Julia to wait in the corridor herself, almost running. Coordinator Skoya, where's Miranda? She stopped by the office. No longer working gloomily over her shoulder, the head of the department, Frank, answered her. Oh, how could she be? She's on shift today. I'm the one who's on call. And our mommy, without informing anyone, quit last night and left. Where? To the historical homeland. Smirked the superintendent. She thinks that in Germany she will be sweet, eat, and sleep well. It was a time when ethnic Germans were leaving the country in droves. They were welcomed by a foreign country, and whether it would become their native country was a big question. But they were leaving, so she was rushing. Cindy bit her lip in frustration. This was something she hadn't expected. Now what do we do? Cindy, what did you want? Frank and looked carefully at his employee. It's your day off. Cindy laughed a little, but the problem with her daughter had to be solved quickly. After all, it was already clear that Julia had dragged Julia to nowhere else. Mike died in early June. Now it's mid-September. Frank, I'm in trouble with my daughter. She's 16 years old, and she's clearly knocked up. The superintendent squinted his eyes a little. It happens, and I didn't notice anything. It's clearly past her due date. Maybe you can tell me what to do. Do I still have to study? What to do? The doctor sneered. Give birth. Okay, relax. I'm kidding. Cindy rashly rushed over to Julia. She sat in the office, neither dead nor alive. "Come on," Cindy whispered. "A man will see you in the superintendent's office." Julia blushed and stopped. "Jesus." Cindy rolled her eyes and was ready to snap at her daughter, but barely restrained herself. "Julia, he's a doctor. There's nothing to do." The girl agreed to be examined. She was sent to the examination room. Only the superintendent pointed her employee at the door. "He'll take care of it himself." For about 15 minutes, Cindy picked the door of the examination room, trying to hear something from the conversation between the superintendent and his daughter. But as luck would have it, the door was heavy and tightly closed. Only scraps of phrases came through. Finally, slightly flushed and excited Julia came out of the examination room and said that the doctor wanted to talk to the mom. "I take it, Cindy, that you are in no mood to become a grandmother?" Frank asked her. "I'm only 42. Cindy exclaimed. "No, of course not." "And how old is your daughter?" "I gave birth to her at 20, not 16. Cindy replied with offense. "And let your daughter give birth at 16, not 18. "Cindy, it's a fact that Julia will have to give birth. Her organs are such that her pregnancy is a miracle. And if you terminate it now, it'll guarantee her infertility in the future. And it's a long time. How many? 15 weeks. Oh my God, it's overwhelming. Cindy, what am I in for? Another freeloader in the family. What if the woman offered a couple ways to get rid of the pregnancy? Drugs." But the doctor just shook his head. And then he got angry. "How can you suggest such a thing? It's like crippling a girl." "Cindy, take this fact as a given," he said, "and I warn you not to do anything yourself. I'll know what's going on right away. I won't keep quiet. If Julia comes to us with any unexplained bleeding, Cindy's gone." Frank sat down in the chair, leaned back, and wondered if he had done the right thing. Julia didn't have any health problems. It was just that when the doctor asked her about the stay, she burst into tears. Told him how her mom insisted on it. And this is a child from a loved one who is no longer here. And the doctor also remembered how embarrassed Cindy was when she found out Miranda had gone away and wanted to do it without her daughter's permission. Miranda would have agreed to that. He wouldn't. Let the girl have the baby. It's a great thing. It's a new person. Frank was sure that Cindy wouldn't hurt her daughter anymore. She's a cowardly woman, that Cindy only knows how to yell at the weak. And to be honest, she was a regular complaint in the ward. But who's going to replace her anyway? He warned her that he would recognize medical intervention if Julia got sick. It was a risk Cindy would not take. Home Julia and Cindy returned home in silence. The girl was jubilant. A small victory, but a victory. Her victory. Cindy was distraught. What was she going to do now? People would laugh at her. She couldn't convince her daughter. And most of all, it made her angry. Why should she have another back to chew on? If she gives birth, I'll make her give it up right away. That's what she decided. The news that the 11th grader in the position very quickly spread around the neighborhood. Although Julia and hid the growing tummy, still came the moment when no longer helped. Not loose blouses, not stretched sweaters. The principal, of course, called Cindy to the school to talk about her daughter. What can I say? Pregnant. And there's no hiding it. But you realize that Julia will have to leave the school, the principal said. I agreed. To be honest, Julia was glad. Tired of these curious looks of classmates, condemnations of teachers. So, understudied only 6 months, the girl left school. At home, Cindy practically did not talk to her daughter, could not see her. Disgraced us. She complained to her eldest daughter over the phone. Helen just gasped in response. So she threw the number out. The younger sister, she and Alex, haven't even thought about kids yet. And Julia, she's already got a potbelly. She was a fool to agree with Helen's mother. She ruined her whole life. And they talked quietly with Allah for a long time. Julia didn't listen to their conversations. She knew they were discussing her. But how could she be sick of it? Everything will be fine, she whispered. She stroked her growing belly. Don't worry, baby, I won't hurt you. And then she was coming back from the store and met Wendy's grandmother, Mike's grandmother. Oh, honey, the old lady was so happy. How are you? Why did you come over to my house? I saw your mom here. She told me all kinds of things. Oh, she says you'll have a baby with Mike. Why did you say anything? I'm embarrassed, Julia confessed. I didn't know how you'd take it. I didn't know how you'd take it. Where's the subtlety? I almost jumped for joy. When your mother told me everything, it means I'm gonna have a grandchild or a great-grandchild. Why are you so rambling? Did your mother insult you? The old woman looked anxiously into Julia's eyes. The girl nodded uncertainly. Then she exclaimed, she insults me every day. I've disgraced her and everything. What a bastard, you scolded Grandma Wendy. Do you know you can come and live with me? You may even have to, and don't be afraid of your mother. We'll go right now. We'll pack your things and come and live with me. What happiness! Our people will not be cut off. Julia liked the idea. She was tired of living, listening to her mother's reproaches and insults every day. Cindy was on duty that day, so Julia calmly went to the apartment, taking only the essentials. On the way out, she remembered one more thing. She went into the room and took out from the nightstand the very bracelet made of beads. It was now her talisman. Julia decided. Grandma Wendy was waiting for her at the entrance to go up to the 3rd floor and then down. The poor old lady was exhausted. Give me that. Grandma Wendy took the small personal bag from the girl. You shouldn't be carrying heavy things right now. She's not heavy. Julia smiled sadly. That's basically all my stuff. It's all right, my dear, we'll live well together. Oh, we'll live well. Don't worry, everything will be fine for you and our baby. Wendy's grandmother was talking on the road. The girl listened to her and only sighed. She could not believe that she suddenly solved her problems so easily. Why hadn't she gone to Grandma Wendy before? Yes, I was ashamed. But she's so nice. I just have to tell your mother not to worry at home. Grandma Wendy remembered. I wrote her a note that I've gone to live with you, Julia reassured her. That's right. Good for you. Grandma Wendy gave Julia Mike's room. The girl timidly went in there. She sat down on the couch. Everything here reminded her of him. Julia had been his guest before. Here was the desk behind him. They used to do homework together. Books on the shelf, boxing gloves, on nails. Julia felt her heart clench with pain. She would never see Mike again. She lay back on the pillow. She imagined Mike lying there. She remembered his hair, his face, and cried bitterly. Grandma Wendy came into the room. Oh my God. She splashed her hands and hurried to the girl, sat down next to her and hugged her. Honey, don't cry, or I'll cry myself. All this time I've been waiting for God to take me in. I couldn't understand why he kept me here. And now I realize it's not time. I still have a great-grandson to raise. Or about granddaughter Julia, or about granddaughter. Grandma Wendy agreed, as God will give. But in any case, remember that a child is happiness. And spit on those who say nasty things to you you're doing everything right. The old lady hugged the girl, and they sat for a long time, remembering Mike. And the next day, Cindy came to Grandma Wennett's house. Where's Julia? She asked irritably. You're at my place, aren't you? The old lady replied calmly. Then call me to tell her something. She's still asleep. Don't bother the girl. You're making her nervous enough as it is. You don't want to support her. You're giving her a train. You can't do that. The girl made a mistake, who could be wrong. She wasn't young herself, and I didn't go to school with a potbelly, Cindy grinned. And I don't understand. Are you a mother to your daughter or an animal? Don't judge and you won't be judged. Look, I'm tired of the old ones. The smartest one is the one who gets the grandson. She's the one who did the deed. And she's such a dandelion of God. Don't you touch my grandson. He was a good boy. And if you were alive, Julia, yours would be the happiest. Would you feel sorry for your child now? And you're like a wolf. What am I saying to you? You can't hear me anyway. Why did you even come here? Tell me, but I'll tell you, Cindy said with her head down. Julia's gone, and to hell with her. She decided to solve her own problems. Let her solve her own problems. Don't let her come to me. I don't want her puppy. I'm out of here, Grandma Wendy said in a quiet voice. Or I'm going down the stairs with help. I'm strong enough, Cindy grinned. Then she turned and went downstairs. Grandma Wendy slammed the door and sat in the hallway for a long time sighing. Julia, you've had it coming. Why did she get such a mother? We'll get through this. As long as God gives us health, Grandma whispered to Wendy. And she went to the kitchen to make pancakes. And Julia lay in her room. She was awake, and she could hear Grandma Wendy and her mother talking. And once again, she wanted to cry. Why didn't her mother love her? If something like this had happened to Helen, she would have had a different attitude. How hurtful. But she won't beg for her mother's love anymore. Yesterday, in a note, Julia wrote, Cindy, Mom, you don't have to force yourself to love me and my baby and take care of us. I can do it all on my own, and Grandma Wendy will help me do it. And Cindy agreed with the contents of the note and came to say so. If Daddy had been alive, he wouldn't have let it happen. But it happened the way it happened. The last months before the birth were the most amazing months of Julia's life. It was the first time she'd ever been cared for like that. And it seemed like a stranger had become closer to her mother and Grandma Wendy. They cooked together in the kitchen, cleaned the house together. The old lady did not burden Julia, even tried to clean the floor herself. Julia, however, defended this right. I wear a mop, and wear and on my knees can, she said. Taking the floor cloth from Grandma Wendy. Pregnancy is not a disease. Why are you treating me like a piece of paper? I can do everything around the house, especially, as many people say. They used to give birth in the fields and then go to work. Sweet fools, they say it was not easy to bear and give birth to a child at all times. Grandma Wendy shook her head as Julia scrubbed the baseboards. And you're good, my good girl. What are you doing with that floor? Cut a hole. And the old lady would start cursing jokingly. And Julia would answer her back jokingly. During this time, they became each other's closest friends. The girl regularly went to the antenatal clinic. She was fine. She never crossed paths with her mother. Yeah, she worked at the maternity hospital. But Julia was terrified of what would happen if she went into labor on her shift. She was afraid of Cindy from the time spent at Grandma Wendy's and realized that she didn't miss her mother or sister at all. Aunt Helen, by the way, for all the time she hadn't bothered to call, didn't know Grandma Wendy's home phone number, maybe, but where she lived. She could have at least checked with Cindy. It's only 2 blocks from her parents' apartment, so she didn't want to. One day, the sisters did meet. Julia walked cautiously out of the store, watching her step. It had thawed recently, and now it was slippery with frost. Wendy's grandmother wanted to go for bread and milk, but she was sick, her blood pressures skyrocketing, so Julia went. Sis, are you there? She heard a surprised exclamation. Next to the sidewalk stood a brand new cherry-colored 9, a very fashionable car at that time. And Helen was standing by the car. Pretty, so pretty, snow-white coat with the same hat, just like the Snow Maiden. Julia looked like a scarecrow next to her. She could only fit into her grandmother Wendy's old coat because of her growing belly. Helen approached Julia with undisguised interest and scrutinized her. She stood with one hand clutching the grocery bag and the other clutching her stomach, her eyes downcast, as if she were guilty of something in front of her sister. Sis, I don't recognize you, Helen grinned. As you once Barabanova, so I'm going to give birth soon. Julia said quietly. To give birth? Helen grinned. Well, you've made a mess of things. How are you now? I'm okay. Good. Alex and I are fine too. I've almost written my thesis. Lesha opened a news store, bought a car. Well done. We didn't think about the baby. Did Helen's eyes round? Oh no, and I wasn't going to until today. When I saw you, I don't think I'll ever want one. I care more about my figure. All right, sis, we're going. And she ducked into the car. Julia only now noticed that in the car waiting for her was Alex, who did not even come out to her relative, sitting bored looking behind the wheel in a fancy sheepskin coat. Yes, he and Helen seemed to be having a blast. The sister drove off without even kissing Julia goodbye. She didn't touch her at all. It felt like she even squeamishly got out of the car specifically to show off in front of her little sister. Julia grinned sadly, acting like a noblewoman. That's fine. Grandma Wendy was already in the kitchen. Grandma, why did you get up? Julia was surprised. Stay down. I'm going to make some food. How long have you been lying down? Already all the sides from lying down. Jokingly grumbled Grandma Wendy. It's better for me. Why are you so pale and sad? It's bad to call an ambulance. It's all right. Don't. I shook my head negatively. Julia, I've been thinking about who my family really is, my mom, my sister. They're like strangers to me. And she told me about her meeting with Helen. The old lady listened and blushed in embarrassment. She didn't even hug her own sister. What a bastard. Well, maybe she was expecting me to go first, but it was so slippery. I put my arms around her and she wouldn't even move. She's a bad girl, Yerlina. Don't think about her. She's the kind of girl who gets her nose up high and then falls down. You'll see. Your sister will come running to you. She'll remember you're related. You're the only one who'll remember the situation. What happened today? Don't help her. She won't appreciate it anyway. Mark my words. Grandma Wendy looked questioningly at Julia. And since that's the case, let's go and get our things ready. Oh, Grandma Wendy. And when did you have time to cook them? Vegetables you're ready to leave before a can of stew on top. Cheap and surly and delicious. Julia laughed and deliciously repeated the old lady. She bought the girl and poked her in the cheek ringingly. And how many times have I told you not to throw it away? We're family. The closest thing to family, Julia agreed. It's just habit. I love you, Grandma Wendy. If it wasn't for you, I don't know what I'd be doing right now. You're my guardian angel. But what do you say? The old lady laughed. Angels have wings, I can barely walk home with my legs. So what? You have the soul of an angel. Thank you. Julia kissed the old lady in return. And then they had dinner together, socialized. Then they watched an endless TV series, and they had a good time. Julia smiled as she fell asleep that night. It's true, they say that relatives are not always blood relatives. Sometimes strangers are much closer. Though what a stranger Grandma Wendy is, it's the baby that binds them together now. Who would be born? Julia never knew. But it didn't matter. But one thing was certain. If it was a girl, it would be Wendy. The baby in her belly gently moved its hand as if in agreement. It was February, and the delivery date was getting closer. The more anxious Julia was anxious about the unknown, terrified her. And although Grandma Wendy calmed her in every possible way, told her how everything would be, even bought her a book, Julia did not become calmer. Grandma Wendy herself worried her. Almost every day, the old lady's blood pressure jumped. The ambulance would come, the paramedic would give her a shot and head for the door. Maybe we should go to the hospital, shyly asked Julia. Why? The paramedic wondered. They won't put you there anyway. What do you want? Age? And Grandma Wendy didn't want to go to the hospital. Who am I betting you on? She shook her head. I'm fine. You should go to the hospital yourself. What did the doctor tell you? She said I should go in early. Julia agreed. But I can't leave you. And she couldn't be persuaded. And then the ambulance had to be called. Julia's labor began a little earlier, unexpectedly in the middle of the night. And from the pain, she was able to pack her things herself, put in her purse and her talisman, the bracelet. And then I woke up Grandma Wendy. Oh, honey, the old lady was worried. You will be patient now already in the maternity hospital. Julia saw her mother. She was on duty, and Julia remembered everything like a fog. And only when it was over, she saw her mother's contemptuous grin in front of her. But what mother? You have a daughter. And she didn't even show the little girl. In vain Julia cried, begged Cindy. She had switched to another woman in labor. Another woman came in that night, and it was much more complicated. She had come to the hospital after a car accident. Jenna and David were returning from relatives in the capital. David was driving a brand new car, a gift from his father-in-law. A beast, not a car. He rejoiced. And then David overtook the car. The road is slippery, it's dark. He did not calculate the distance to the nearest car, and from the oncoming lorry flew at him. David managed to steer the car away, but did not keep it on the side of the road. The car went into a ravine. David wasn't hurt, and Jenna wasn't even wrong. But she went into labor, and she had a month's worth of labor to carry. Cindy labored carefully, saw her husband in the waiting room, appreciated her clothes and jewelry, realized they're not the easiest birds to bring in. We have to try harder. Otherwise, we're gonna get a lot of complaints. only all Cindy's efforts were in vain. Jenna's baby was stillborn. It was a boy. Exhausted. Jenna didn't even realize it right away. "Why isn't he screaming?" she whispered at last. "Weak because it's weak," Cindy answered, pointing her eyes at the orderly to keep quiet. "They're taking him to the ditch now. Don't worry. You need to sleep now." When Jenna was taken to the ward, she came out to her husband and told him what had happened. "Oh my God, how could it be?" David cried. "We've been looking forward to this baby. Do not worry, you will not have more children. This pregnancy with Ira was like a miracle. The doctors said that this chance was the only one. It's all my fault. And I'm dead. What's in it for you?" Cindy sighed. "I'd better go," David whispered. He sat down on the couch with his head on his head and thought. 2 years ago, David had been a simple guy. After technical university, he got a job in one of the capital's telephone installation companies. His mother lived in the village. He received a small salary, rented a room from a kind old lady. Then he met Jenna by chance in a cafe. She seemed to him a simple and sweet girl. Well, Jenna was. But her daddy was a banker, an ex-gangster. David. Jacob immediately took with distrust, but seeing how his daughter just blossoms next to David, did not interfere with their relationship. When the young people decided to get married, a little lurked. Not such a son-in-law, he wanted his only daughter. But what can you do when love? Agreed to the wedding and Jacob. Only after the registration quietly warned David, "Once my girl will cry for you, and I will destroy you, crushed like a cockroach." David remembered those words well. No Jenna. He loved her dearly. But the bandit father was a bit of a strain. He used everything Jacob gave him, though. And he bought the young ones an apartment and a car, and got David a job at his bank. And everything in this life began to shine brightly. As time went on, Jenna began to worry why they couldn't have a baby. They went to the best doctors, and they gave a disappointing answer. Jenna can't have children. They grieved and settled down, and then it was a miracle. Despite all the doctors' predictions, Jenna got pregnant. All through the pregnancy, Jenna was careful to follow all the doctors' recommendations. David fulfilled her every whim. Jacob was proud. Soon, he would have a grandchild. And then David decided to go visit his mom. And Jenna wanted to go for a ride with him. And it's no problem that she was already 8 months pregnant, because Daddy had given her a reliable car. David's a good driver. He didn't want to take his wife with him, to be honest. But how could he refuse his beloved? So we went together. We stayed at my mom's for a couple of days and then went home. And then the accident. And now, sitting in the hospital, David imagined how he would tell his father-in-law about the accident, about the death of his grandson. And Jenna, how would she survive it all? He felt sorry for his wife to the point of tears. But Jacob's anger he really feared. After all, he had once warned him about such a man as Jacob. Words to the wind does not throw in the wind. Suddenly a plan formed in David's head. "Did you deliver Ira's baby?" He looked at Cindy. "Did you tell her about the baby's death?" "Not yet." The midwife shook her head. "But we'll have to report it tomorrow. Don't speak," while he was belittling. He looked into her eyes, hesitated, gathering his thoughts, and then blurted out. "Say, and maybe we can make a deal. I'll pay you well." "Very well. What do you mean?" Cindy was surprised. "Well, maybe you have some abandoned child, or maybe you've had a bad mother. You just change the kids and I'll pay you bet. Are you out of your mind?" Cindy exclaimed. "How can you imagine that?" "No, and no again." She turned sharply and walked away. Even for her, such a suggestion was beyond morals and rules. That's not the way to do it. And at the station that night, the phone was ringing off the hook. "Yes, someone's calling," Cindy grumbled. 3 o'clock in the morning, and they can't sleep, Dad. They're drunk and calling. She picked up the phone, ready to bark at another happy new dad. Just as suddenly she heard Helen's voice. Her daughter was crying her eyes out. "Helen, my daughter, what's wrong?" Cindy gasped. "Calm down, I can't understand a word you're saying." There was a sobbing rumble in the receiver. Then came Helen's calmer voice. Turns out her LX got into a bit of a scrape. He decided to expand his assortment, to open a few more outlets in the market. and for this purpose to borrow money from very influential, but very dangerous types in the city. They gave me money, and everything seemed to go as it should. But the market began to redistribute power, and one day the tents went up in flames. All of Alex's goods died in the fire, and now he owed a huge sum to the bandits, and there's interest. Every day dripping sobs. Helen told me, "It's such a sum, we'll never be able to pay it back." And today, Lyosha came all beaten up. That's how he was warned. They said they'll beat him every day, until Mom pays the debt. I don't know what to do. I'm scared. They told him they'd get me too. You poor thing. Cindy exclaimed. How much? Helen said how much. Cindy gasped. It's in rubles, I hope it's in dollars. Mom, they'll probably kill us with Alex now. Wait, daughter, I'll think of something, Cindy promised. She hung up the phone and sat for a long time as if in a daze. Something had to be done. Helen had to be rescued. The solution to the problem came unexpectedly. Cindy even smiled at her own thoughts. After all, it was simple. The main thing was not to comfort Daddy there in the emergency room. She went downstairs and still sat with her head up. Cindy came over and sat down next to him. Then quietly said 2,000 greenbacks. What? David looked at her slowly. If you pay me that amount by morning, you will have a perfectly healthy baby girl. A girl. But we had a boy. Sometimes doctors make mistakes. How does that work? You'll take the baby from another woman. David whispered in horror. How can that be? Isn't that what you asked me to do? Cindy whispered angrily. And you don't have to worry. This baby was born to a minor, and she doesn't need it. But it is also my daughter, without letting David say, said hello, David. Stunned stared at the couch. What is she offering him? Yes, he asked for something like this. But I didn't expect it to happen like this, much less a daughter. She wants to take a child away from her own daughter. What will your daughter say? There'll be a scandal. There won't be anything. I've switched the children. I don't understand. So, is that your decision? Or do you accept the amount I told you? Or will there be no other chance? I'll take it, but I have to go to the bank. It's the middle of the night. There's still time before the bank opens. I was just doing the paperwork. Good. David nodded uncertainly, wondering how much money he had in his account. It seemed to be enough. Cindy went to the branch and took care of the paperwork. It was fortunate that she was on duty alone tonight. No doctor, just an orderly. Less people to know, the better. And the orderly will shut her mouth. The main thing is that Frank is on a business trip, so everything should go smoothly. She filled out the forms and went to the nursery with the new tags. And in the morning, the new shift came in. Cindy, what? Adriana's coworker said with a smile, Can I congratulate you? Aunt Kelly said your daughter had a baby girl. Aunt Kelly got it all wrong. Cindy replied glumly, My daughter gave birth to a dead boy. How so? Adriana gasped. Aunt Kelly said it was another woman. Aunt Kelly, it's high time you took a vacation. The old one's been saying all sorts of things. Oh, honey, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. Well, I'm sorry. Thank you. Cindy went to her daughter's room. Julia was already awake. She looked anxiously at the door. Seeing her mother perked up, Mom, why am I not carrying my girl? In excitement, she asked. Others have already been brought, but not me. What kind of girl did you get from labor consciousness? Cindy looked at her daughter in amazement. Julia, my good girl. You had a boy. But I remember you said you were mixed up. You had a boy, but brace yourself, it's a girl. The baby died almost immediately after birth. He was weak. That's why I didn't give it to you right away. When Julia heard that, the boy died. God, why did she have to go through all this? Maybe it's not true. The mother didn't want the baby so badly. She whispered, and then she screamed, liar. Did you kill him? Julia became hysterical. Adriana came and gave the unhappy mother a strong sedative. Sleep, girl, Adriana whispered softly. You'll calm down a little. I don't believe it. Falling asleep and whispered Julia. It was she who ruined him. No, you're wrong. It happens. Sometimes babies die. They do. I don't blame Mom. She did the right thing. Adriana said many other comforting things. Looking the girl over the head, Cindy stood in the room. turned away to the window. Depicting the universal scorpion, she exulted in her heart. Everyone believed her. All that was left was to get the money. And having handed in her shift, she went downstairs. David was already standing at the hospital door. "Walk me out," Cindy nodded to him, and they walked down the alley. David waited for her to start talking. He withdrew the money. They lay in the car, which had been virtually unharmed in the accident. Cindy walked furtively looking around. "Did you have the money ready?" Finally, she asked. "Yes, it's in the car." "Then yes, take me home." David nodded in agreement. And already in the cabin, he handed her a package. Cindy, counting the money. "It's all right," she said, satisfied. "So that's how you had a baby girl. Born at 9 p.m. Got it." David tried to smile, but it wasn't working. The guilt was burning him from the inside out. "Tell me, Jenna and I's baby, what's going to happen to him?" "I buried him as my grandson." "Don't worry," Cindy told him calmly. "And forget the whole thing. You have a daughter now, and that's the main thing." 2 days passed. The incident with the baby who had died in childbirth had subsided. Everyone sympathized. "Cindy, you're a midwife yourself." And then this happened to her grandson. Granny Kelly was surprised at first, but then decided it was none of her business. She decided to forget the whole thing. Let Cindy deal with her daughter herself. The head of the maternity hospital had not yet returned from his business trip. And so far everything for him was decided by a young Dr. Zarina. Cindy came to talk to her. "You're writing my daughter. Please forgive me," she said. "How?" "She'd need a couple more days of rest." The doctor was surprised. "It's hard on her, you know. There's moms and kids around. She's on her own, and I'm home to watch her if she needs it." "Yes, you're right. Poor girl, when are you going to bury your grandson?" "Yes, you write to Julia, and we'll bury her together." Clearly nodded Zarina and began to prepare the documents for discharge. At the same time, Julia was lying in the ward, turned to the wall, and did not want to see or hear anyone. Her grandmother Wendy brought her a parcel and wrote her a note. The old lady was very worried too, that everything had happened like that, but she still tried to comfort Julia. She wrote that everything would work out for her, but how to survive such a thing. And next to her in the next bed, a happy mommy was stealing. Jenna was transferred to the same room. "Oh girls, you don't know how happy I am," she said, gently pressing the cherished piece to herself. "I had such an accident with my husband. And everything's fine, and my baby's with me. I was so scared when I had her. I thought I'd lost her. And then everything's fine. My little girl. But the doctors were wrong. They told us it would be a boy, and doctors are often wrong." Another woman answered her. "Svetlana was here for the 3rd time. They told me I was going to have a daughter too. No, it's a boy. And with my first child, the doctors were wrong. I had a daughter." So the women counted and gave something else, and then suddenly stopped talking, staring at Julia. She was crying quietly. The women began to console the girl. "But what can you say, when your baby's all right?" Soon Cindy entered the room. "Daughter, come on, get ready to be discharged," she said to Julia. She nodded obediently and sighed with relief. She wanted to get out of here. Gathering her things, she found at the bottom of her purse the very bracelet, which, as she thought, as luck would have it, did not help her bracelet. She looked at it thoughtfully. "We should throw it away," she decided. Soon Julia was on her way downstairs. Cindy, playing the caring mother, wanted to call a cab, but the girl refused. "I'll drive myself," replied the mother. "Okay, how do you want to go?" Indifferently answered her. "Don't forget the funeral tomorrow." The girl shuddered at these words, but kept silent. She walked out of the hospital. From the fresh air of the bright sun, she felt dizzy. The girl hardly came to the bench and sat down. She could breathe. It was surprisingly warm for February. It seemed that spring had already come. From the roof replaced the drip. Sparrows chirped. Life was in need, and she was burying her son tomorrow. Tears dripped on the shabby bench. The girl pulled out her bracelet. "Didn't you help me?" she whispered. And then she heard a man's voice. "Girl, are you ill? Should I call a doctor?" At the bench stood the same David with a large bag full of food and children's things. He was carrying a package to Irina and her daughter. Julia shook her head. She twirled her bracelet thoughtfully. "No, there's nothing wrong with me," she answered quietly. "It's my boy who's in trouble." "Boy," smiled David, not realizing how many more of these boys you would have. He honestly thought that it was a young girl who had a fight with her boyfriend, and now she was sitting there worrying. Julia looked at him blankly and then turned her gaze back to the bracelet. "My baby died in childbirth." Suddenly she confessed, "And I still cannot believe it. Everything was fine, and I was sure that nothing would happen. I imagined that this bracelet is my amulet with me even in the hospital. Stupid. It didn't help my baby." "When did it happen?" "Paler?" asked David. "February 15 at night," cried Julia, wiped away a tear and stood up. "You excuse me, I'll go." And she threw the bracelet into the trash can and walked down the path, away from the hospital. And David stared at her in confusion. It turns out that this is the same girl who gave birth to their daughter with Jenna on the midwife, and described her as a rip-off, as a girl of easy behavior. And here's a normal, nice girl who's genuinely grieving her grief, without realizing what she's doing. Bent over the dope and took out a bracelet, twirled it in his hands. "Sure you say," he whispered. "Let it be with our little girl in memory of you. I'm sorry, girl, but I can't do otherwise. My father-in-law would destroy me." Jacob was already fighting so hard when he found out David had been in an accident. What would he do if he knew the baby was dead? Jacob was actually glad. Became a grandfather a little sooner than expected. But what can you do? And the fact that the granddaughter, so it's even better that he will have a little princess. Grandfather will give her everything. All doubts. David walked briskly to the emergency room to take the handover to his girls. And Julia went back to her grandmother Wendy. The old woman, seeing the girl on the doorstep of her apartment, immediately embraced her. They cried together and then had a long talk. Fate is such a sighing grandmother Wendy. And Julia agreed with her fate. And the next day they buried the baby. At the funeral were only Julia, Grandma Wendy, and Cindy, who organized everything. The mother was surprisingly attentive with her daughter on her shoulder, stroking Helen. Why didn't she come? Julia suddenly remembered when they had already left the cemetery. Oh, Helen is having one of those right now. Lush is sick, and then there's business problems. And she's got a diploma to pass. Cindy didn't have time to explain it to her. Don't take offense. And I'm not offended, Julia answered with her head down. Although it was very bitter that her older sister did not support her at such a moment. After the funeral of her great-grandson, Wendy's grandmother became seriously ill. She was taken to the hospital for a massive heart attack. Doctors told Julia. The girl thought she was going to lose her mind. At first a child, now the only person who supported her in everything, she prayed as best she could. That heaven would send Grandma Wendy the strength, for the old woman was slowly fading away in the hospital. Nothing holds me anymore. In this world, she whispered. Nothing. And a week later, Grandma Wendy died, buried next to Mike and little Ethan. That's what Julia had named her boy. Julia was alone. No, she had a mother and sister, but there was no contact with them. Cindy was still only interested in her eldest daughter's affairs. And Helen was doing well. Alex paid off his debts, was opening a new store, where she took money to solve his problems. He preferred not to think about it. Helen, on the other hand, knew everything perfectly well. Cindy had told her, "Did you do the right thing, Mommy?" She encouraged Cindy. Why would that little girl have a baby? She's still a kid herself. At least she did something useful for us. You didn't tell her, Cindy, but will yours. I won't tell her anything. Let her go to the baby's grave and cry. Dickhead. Ruined her life. And they were both talking about a 17-year-old girl. Like she wasn't even their own. She was. After the death of Grandma Wendy, Julia continued to live in her apartment, and then suddenly found out that the old lady to her and bequeathed her home. And a small bank account. And Wendy had no other heirs. How did you find out about the will? Cindy showed up at her daughter's house. So you're still a minor. So I will decide what to do with this apartment and the money, said the mother from the doorstep. Go home. We'll sell this apartment. The money Helen will have to give. Lesha, now they're expanding. He needs it more. And we are one family, one family. Julia was shaking with anger. Helen didn't even deign to come to my child's funeral to support me, and I have to help her. It's not gonna happen. Who's gonna ask you? You're still a minor. I'm 18 in a month. I know what I'm supposed to do. Mom, go away. That's how you and your mother put your lips together. Cindy embarrassed her mother. And now she's sticking up her nose. All right then. And she left, slamming the door. And Julia collapsed on the couch and cried all night for the rest of her life. Helen was all that mattered to Mom. She was like a blank slate. Julia realized that she no longer had the strength to live in the same city with her mother and sister. They will always remind her of her past, even though she has done nothing terrible. And her mother always makes her look like a promiscuous, silly girl. After a few months, Julia left for the capital, having sold her grandmother Wendy's apartment. She decided to start her life with a clean slate. Julia took advantage of her diploma and enrolled in a cultural college to study library science, with dreams of becoming a translator. It didn't work out. She couldn't make it alone. She had to finish school and pass her exams. All the events of her life broke the girl down. She'll be a librarian, and that's enough for her, especially since the school immediately gave her a place in the dormitory, assigned a stipend. To live on those crumbs, of course, was unbearable. And soon Julia found a part-time job in a publishing house for a trifle translated texts. At first, she was not trusted with complex works. After all, the girl is completely uneducated. But the girl in the work proved that she can. So gradually, she earned experience. Little by little, the income grew. In parallel, Julia studied. And after college, she was called to a permanent position in the publishing house. In addition, she enrolled in the Institute by correspondence, as she had wanted before at the Faculty of Foreign Languages. And yet her dream came true. Only now she didn't dream of working as a translator. She was happy working in a publishing house. Julia lived alone with her mother and sister and did not communicate. On the proceeds from the apartment, Baba took money, which she carefully kept in the bank. She was able to buy a modest single room. It was 25 years after the birth of the child Julia lived in the capital. Her career didn't work out. She was just a full-time employee of a publishing house. She lived in the same small apartment, and her personal life didn't work out. Although, to be honest, she didn't try to make it work. There were small romances, but then Julia was dumped. Then she was disappointed. And then the time came when Julia was 42 years old. "No, girlfriend, you need to get married, don't you?" Molly persuaded her. They worked together in publishing. "It's not right for a woman to be alone. You know, and you'll have a baby before you know it." "I'm definitely not having a baby." Julia smiled sadly. "You know my story. So many years have passed, and I remember the horror when I lost my son. So immediately in a stupor, I fall into a stupor. I don't want anything." Molly nodded sympathetically. Yes, Julia had told her the sad pages of her life, but how can you live in the past? "Julia, why do you think everything will be bad? You just don't understand what you're giving up. I have a son and a daughter. Nastya is about to graduate from college. Andrew is a dork, of course, but he plays soccer so well. Not children, that's happiness. All right, you don't want kids, but you need a man. I've had men, you know, but not the right ones, you know. I'll never meet another man like Mike. You remember Mike as a teenager. And they're all great when they're not about anything at all. How else would you have worked out? Molly, don't. Oh, I'm sorry." Molly and realized she'd said something unnecessary. Julia cherished the memory of her first lover. She was just sorry that a beautiful, smart, young woman was lonely. And Julia was indeed lonely. For many years, she had not communicated with her mother or her sister. After a few years, as moved to the capital, Cindy tried to establish relations with her, even came to visit. Julia at first even rejoiced. And then she realized her mother was finding out her financial situation. Helen and her husband needed another helping hand. So Julia told her mother everything she thought about her and her sister. "You're just wondering where to get some money. I don't have any money. You see, I don't smoke myself. But you live in Washington too," Cindy remarked. "It's not that simple." "No, it's not. There's a reason you're talking about it now. When I left here as a girl, did you ever think about how I live here? What I was eating on, where I was living? Did you have that old lady's money? That old lady? Grandma Wendy was the most wonderful woman in the world. She gave me the first maternal love that you didn't give me. And you brought up her money. What do you have to do with it? You, Helen. You're both greedy as rats. But my daughter. Thank you. That's when Cindy burst into flames. Is that what you think of us? I'll never set foot in this place again. Don't. Julia shouted after her. And for years, neither mother nor sister came. Sometimes Julia thought she was doing the wrong thing. They were family after all. But then a bitter wave of memories came over her and she calmed down. She has her own life. In all these years, she'd never been to her hometown. At first, she was drawn to at least visit the gravesites. Father Mike, Grandmother Wendy, and Sonny Boy, how it all worried her. And for several years, as Julia ordered on the internet services of the ritual company to care for the graves of people close to her. But one day she decided to visit her hometown. It was her father's anniversary. She did not go to her mother, rented a hotel room, and then went to the cemetery. The graves were in order. Julia sat next to the grave of Grandma Wendy Mike and son for a while. Then she told her father's story and walked down the path to the exit. Bah, what people! Suddenly, she heard a swaggering female voice. Julia turned her head in surprise and involuntarily wrinkled her nose. Some kind of homeless people were looking at her. Dirty, smelly, of no particular age. That you do not recognize a sister native. The bum smiled, showing half-rotted teeth. It is Helen and Julia, ahked and almost fell from surprise. Looking closer, she realized that the bum was not lying. Indeed, this is her older sister. Same eyes, same nose with a slight backbone. Perhaps that was where the resemblance ended. Julia remembered Helen as beautiful, bright, well-groomed. And now the creature that stood next to her evoked only squeamishness and a lot of questions. Why do you look like that? From? Made from shock? Finally, she asked. That I don't like you. Helen laughed. Yeah, well, I'm a little out of shape right now. Have you seen Dad too? Yeah. How long has it been? How long has our daddy been gone? Helen's mood changed dramatically. Soon she was making a sad grimace, mimicking grief. Stop grimacing. Julia said irritably. You never cared too much about his death. You've suffered too much. Helen snorted. You laughed, and for so many years you didn't show your eyes behind the grave. But I did. Do not lie, you tiredly replied Julia. It was me who paid the workers to clean up my father's grave. Helen stared at her sister in surprise, not knowing what else to reproach her with. Then she decided to change tactics. So let's go. Let's remember Daddy tearfully. She dragged out the familiar song A Few Tomatoes. Julia agreed with her, but taking Helen to the cafe was the height of insanity. They would have kicked out such a visitor from there. So Julia bought sausages, sweets, and lemonade in a small store not far from the cemetery, and went with her sister to a small public garden, which was also nearby. On a bench, she laid out the purchases, divvied up the lemonade, disposable cups. She offered to honor her father. You're so out of touch with your Washington life. Just lemonade. Julia replied calmly and drank from her cup. Helen grinned unhappily. She drank the lemonade in one gulp and immediately put a couple of slices of sausage in her mouth. Tell me, Julia demanded. After a long silence, I came to a life where your Alex is mine. He left me, exclaimed Helen. About 10 years ago, when he found a rich woman. Then he and she went to the South somewhere, and I suffered. He left me no money. I never got a job. I graduated from college. I stayed at home. And to go to the dumpster or cashier did not allow me pride. I have a higher education. So I lived with my mom as best I could. And she asked Julia carefully, Mommy's in trouble. She had a stroke about 5 years ago. She's still walking. Doesn't talk about her. They took her to the Home of Mercy. Why? Julia exclaimed. Couldn't you look after her? I couldn't. Helen shrugged nervously. It's good for you to reason. You try taking pots out from under the bed. We feed her. And then I had a private life. So I asked Social Security to put our mom in a home for the disabled. Well taken care of, shook her head. Julia, how could you? Helen looked at her sister defiantly. It's not for you to judge me. I see. But why are you like this now? What bum? You mean to say that my last husband was a jerk? He managed to sell my apartment and threw me out on the street. So you're saying you blew off your parents' apartment? And Julia just shook her head. And I used to think that you are a smart woman. And I am smart, again with a proud sister replied. You're a complete fool. Okay, I'm going to go. Julia stood up, not wanting to continue this pointless conversation. In which house of the disabled is the mother? Do you want to see her? Helen grinned. I would like to, yes. I don't remember. Can you ask at the Social Security office? Julia shook her head again and walked away. Sis, stop, Helen shouted. I'll give the money to her after them. Julia just sighed. She opened her purse. She didn't have much. I gave her a couple of money. Not much, Helen hummed. Oh, well, I'll give you some more. And I'll tell you a secret. What secret do you know? Julia replied tiredly and waved her hand. You've always been a fool. The sister laughed. Go to your mother. Maybe she will tell you something about your buried child. Julia recoiled when she heard those words. You're out of your mind. I got it. The woman decided and left the square with a quick step. And behind her was the hoarse laughter of her sister. And Social Security. Julia went to that very same house of charity. Your mom can't move an arm or a leg. The nurse at the facility told her as they walked to the room. She can't speak either, just mooing, licking her harmonics. For so many years her heart is strong, that's why she still lives. I just found out about what happened today, as if justifying myself, Julia said, and I could not take her to me. But maybe something is needed? You say? Of course we need diapers, creams, special diapers. I can make a list. Okay, write it down. I'll buy it. And then I'll send you money for it. You can. So many people do it. The nurse replied calmly. Cindy was lying in a single room, aged, sunken. She did not look like herself at all because of her illness. Julia had to try hard to recognize her, but it was her mother. Hello, mother, she said, and touched the woman's hand. I'm Julia. Cindy lay with her eyes closed. Her eyelids fluttered. She stared at her daughter. It was unclear if she recognized her, just lay there watching her mother for a bit. Julia kissed her on the cheek and left the room. Cindy never made a sound. Why did this happen to her? Julia asked Dr. Stress. You don't know anything. Your mother lived with her eldest daughter. And after she divorced her husband, she brought in all kinds of boyfriends. They get violent. Often the police were called. So in one of the scandals and had a stroke. And the daughter immediately did not go to the hospital. Only 3 days later, the woman was taken to the hospital. If it had been sooner, maybe the consequences would not have been so severe. God, what a horror. Julia shook her head. And I thought they were doing just fine. I didn't communicate with them, thinking I was hurt. Don't blame yourself. The doctor answered her gently. I've been working here for so many years. And sometimes it seems to me that everything that has happened to my patients is primarily their fault. Wrong upbringing, unloved children, or even hurt someone. I'll send money to support my mom. That's not really necessary. Her allowance goes towards her maintenance. But to be honest, sometimes you need more. So if you can, but it's not necessary, nodded the doctor. You're an orderly, will you talk? Yes, I already asked, Julia replied. Having solved all the questions, the woman left the institution. She felt so bitter. Her own mother was in an orphanage. But how could she help her? And the doctor was probably right. All her life, her mother had loved only Helen. And she repaid that with black ingratitude. When Julia arrived in Washington, D.C., she was distraught. Bitter thoughts overwhelmed her, and it seems that she did everything she could, but in fact, nothing. She shared her worries with Daria. What else could you do? Her friend was surprised. You can't raise your sister. And your mother. Do you want to move her into your one-room apartment? And then what? You'll have to quit your job because she needs constant care, and caregivers in Washington are expensive. And what kind of life would you have? I can't imagine. Call the shelter, see how your mom's doing. Send money. That's it. There's nothing else you can do. And if you remember how your mother and sister treated you, you can be a monument for your kindness. But I didn't help my sister, and I don't need to. She chose this path herself, and you need to get your mind off sad thoughts. Let's go to a cafe after work. Julia just shrugged her shoulders. Why not? Leaving the publishing house, the women headed for a small cafe. There, in their opinion, were the most delicious pancakes there. They walked along the sidewalk, discussing which ones they would order today. And then Julia saw a little girl about 3 years old running toward the roadway. Her ball was already bouncing confidently between cars. And the girl's mom, like in a slow-motion movie, was running after her daughter. But she wouldn't catch her in time. Julia rushed forward and picked up the girl to literally snatch her from under the wheels of passing cars. There was a screech of brakes. People screamed. Julia stood at the curb, tightly clasping the frightened little girl to herself. "You're crazy," the driver of the car yelled at her. "Watch the child," he drove away. Around fussed people, even at a loss, did not know how to help. Everyone seems to be safe, thank God. The girl's mom came running up, a young woman. "Vanessa, my girl, how can you do that?" The woman cried. "You could have been killed." She pulled the little girl towards her. It had to be done with effort, because Julia's hands were like a chain. And she held the girl tightly. "Oh, take your miracle." Julia came to her senses. "Thank you so much." A woman was flying. I was distracted for a second. The phone rang, and she ran after the ball. A little girl heard the ball and cried. "Oh my God, I'll buy you 10 of these." Through her tears, the mom smiled. And she and the girl went further down the sidewalk. And Julia and Molly went to a cafe. After such a story, we should have a brandy, Molly smiled. They were scared. My soul went to my heels. And you, Julia, you're good. You didn't lose your temper. And I saw that girl running down the road like a village. I didn't realize how it all turned out, Julia admitted. They were still discussing what had happened when a young mother and a girl, familiar to them, came into the cafe. The little girl held a new ball in her hands. They were already smiling at each other like good acquaintances. Molly nodded to them. "Come sit with us." The mom and daughter happily seated themselves at their table. Wendy introduced herself as the girl's mother. "And this madam." She looked at her daughter with feigned strictness. "I am Molly, and your performer's name is Julia." Soon all 4 of them were eating donuts and drinking fragrant tea. Little Vanessa sat next to Julia, trustingly, peering at her. Liked this beautiful aunt, and Julia admired Wendy. A beautiful girl. Her blonde hair curled slightly over her shoulders and such blue eyes. They seemed to reflect the sky. Julia could not escape the feeling that she had seen Wendy somewhere before. But where? "Do you have such a nice name?" she said with a smile to the young mother. "I had a grandmother with that name, the best in the world." "Oh, there's such a story with that name." Wendy laughed. "I've hated it since I was a little girl. My grandfather decided to name me that. He found some information that February 14 is Wendy's birthday, and I was born on February 15th, so that's what they called me. I cried when I was little. I thought it was my grandmother's name, and then it became a holiday. Valentine's Day became a widely celebrated holiday, and I suddenly realized I had the most wonderful name." "You were born on February 15th. Is Julia's voice trembling? "Yes. Why?" "No, I was. It's just that this date is also memorable for me." Julia didn't say anything else, and Wendy didn't insist. Molly, knowing the story with the child, friends talked on distracted topics. Saying goodbye, Wendy suddenly slapped her forehead with the palm of her hand. "I've been thinking about it, and I almost forgot. It's Vicky's birthday in a week. I'd like to invite you." "Why?" Julia was surprised. "We just met. I should thank you in some way. You should come too, Molly. I won't be able to make it. I have a son who's competing. I'm going to cheer for him." I remembered Molly, but Julia, let her come. "It's embarrassing," Julia's blushing. "Do you have your own social circle?" "What circle is there?" "Just Ethan, my husband. A couple of his family friends, Vanessa and Dad, Mom. I have long gone, and Grandpa too. My daughter's still young. We decided not to invite her friends. We'll just go to the amusement park afterwards, that's all." How old will Vika be? Julia asked hesitantly. Wendy smiled at us. Come, you are our saving daughter. Why did you say something? You want Aunt Julia to come to us. I want to, said the girl quietly and looked at Julia. And such piercing blue eyes like her mother's. Julia shuddered. That's who that look reminded her of, a little shaken. She still said yes. And so a week later, having bought a huge doll, Julia was on her way to the address Wendy had told her. The woman was a little worried. Maybe she had accepted the invitation for nothing, but on the other hand, she liked Vanessa and her mom so much. For some reason, she wanted to continue their companionship. As she got off the bus, she realized she was in a very rough neighborhood. There were obviously not ordinary people living here. Julia hesitantly stopped at the mansion with the number Wendy had told her. The woman was a little confused. Maybe the new acquaintances had made a joke like that, or had gotten the house number mixed up. After all, at the first communication, Julia had no idea that she had met millionaires or a millionaire's wife or daughter. The mansion was simply gorgeous. Julia looked at her modest outfit, an ordinary blouse bought at the market and the same pants. No, this society was definitely not for her, and the gift would hardly delight the little girl, who was certainly pampered in this house. The woman looked uncertainly at the CCTV camera bell and turned to leave as the gate opened, and a man in a security guard's uniform peered out from the yard. Julia is an acquaintance of Wendy's, he asked. Yeah, she invited me. That's right. I was warned that a woman was coming. Why are you standing still? Come in, they're waiting for you. The guard smiled and winked at Julia. Confused. I too, when I first came here to get a job, a little timid. But do not worry. The owners are simple people, even though they have money. You're applying for a job too. Julia didn't answer anything. She only smiled slightly at the left guard. She walked along the path between the blooming roses and found herself at the door of the mansion. She was obviously expected here. The door opened and a smiling Wendy appeared on the threshold. Julia, hello. I'm so glad you're here. Come on. Everyone was already gathered. In the living room, a group of 3 young women and 4 men were sitting around the table. One of them was quite a bit older than the others. Wendy immediately introduced Julia to everyone. Lola, Kate, Lisa, Arthur, Peter. These were friends of the Ethan family. Wendy's husband, a tall, handsome blonde man, immediately seated Julia at the table. And David, Wendy's father, poured her some wine. Where's the birthday girl? Julia realized. Oh, she's coming. We can't start without her, Wendy smiled. Vanessa entered the room, accompanied by the nanny. Julia approached the little girl and handed her a doll. Grow up smart and beautiful, she said, and be careful on the street. I will be quiet, said Vanessa, cradling her present. Thank you. Julia stroked the girl's wheat-colored hair and sighed. What power, Mike. And then they all sat around the holiday table. The conversation turned out to be pleasant. Julia had been worried for nothing. No one in this house boasted of their wealth, and certainly no one looked at what Julia was wearing. My daughter told me how you two met, said David, who was sitting next to Julia. Thank you so much. That's what anyone would do, shrugged the woman. You're wrong. Not anyone. You're very brave. Tell me, have we met somewhere? I think I've seen you somewhere before. I don't know. If you were at our publishing house, maybe. No, I don't write Romanovs, smiled David. Maybe you went to the bank for a loan? No. I try to live within my means, to be honest. Slightly blushed, replied Julia, and rightly so. But I definitely recognize your face. He looked at the woman again carefully, but could not remember. Julia was sure he was just confusing her with someone else. People got out of the table. Some of them went to the terrace, and some settled down on the soft sofas. Vanessa came up to Julia and whispered to her. Julia gladly followed the girl to her room. There they got busy with the new doll. Together with Julia, they began to master her new hairstyle. Julia smiled at the doll. Loved it. Vanessa answered as quietly as before. It's a nice doll. I'll call her Julia. She was a precocious and well-developed child. Only a little shy Juliet even wondered and how it is it on the street ran away from Mom. And the girl suddenly thought about something, then smiled at her thoughts. She went to the nightstand and pulled something out of there. "I want to give you a present too," shyly said the girl. "Here, this is my jewelry. Let it be yours." And the little girl held out on the palm of Julia's hand a bracelet of yellow, blue, white beads. When the woman saw it, she was dumbfounded. It was her bracelet, the same one that had been made of amber beads. It had been tweaked a bit after Mike had added multicolored plain beads. It was the bracelet that Julia considered her talisman. And when tragedy struck with her baby, she decided the talisman was nothing and threw it out there. Outside the hospital. "Baby girl." "Thank you," Julia mumbled. "It's beautiful." "Where'd you get that bracelet?" "My mom didn't give it to me." Vanessa insistently held out in jewelry. "Don't worry, she won't swear. It's my bracelet now." Julia took the jewelry. Her hands were shaking. Her heart was pounding like mad. She couldn't understand anything, how this bracelet could be in such a rich house, and in a completely different city. That it was him. There was no doubt. Here was even the tag. One of the beads Mike had carved into it then. Julia and Mike. Tears ran from her eyes. Julia sat down on the floor of the couch. "Auntie, you're not feeling well." Vanessa, who was sitting next to her, slid down to the floor as well. "Don't cry, don't." Julia put her arms around the girl. Past memories came flooding back to her. First love, Mike's death. Pregnancy, waiting for a miracle, and death. This bracelet brought back a wound. So it hurt. Little Vanessa only flapped her eyes in surprise and stroked this grown-up aunt who cried like a little girl. "What were you afraid of?" David peeked into the room, seeing the crying guest. He raised his eyebrows. "What's wrong?" "Auntie is crying," Vanessa said sadly. "I'm sorry," Julia mumbled, wiping away her tears. "It was just a flashback. That bracelet. Do you know where it came from?" And she held out the jewelry. The man's face changed immediately. "Why do you ask?" "Because I used to have it." And then David went completely pale. He suddenly remembered where he had seen Julia. A small town. He and his wife after the accident, Jenna, in the maternity hospital, and knows nothing about the dead child, and his father-in-law is waiting in Washington, and he will not mince words with him. And then that midwife and that crying little girl in the hospital square, sitting on a snow-covered bench. But he couldn't do otherwise. He needed the baby. Why had he taken that bracelet out of the garbage can then? He still doesn't fully understand. He just saw the suffering and unhappy young girls, and realized that this simple piece of jewelry was filled with pleas and prayers for the baby's well-being. Yeah, he felt it at the time. "I knew I was doing a terrible thing, and I just wanted to keep that invisible bond between the baby and the mother." When Wendy was 2, he gave her this bracelet. The girl played with it as she grew older, sometimes wore it. Jenna had nothing against it. Let her play with it. It wasn't particularly valuable jewelry. One day she asked David where he got that funny bracelet. He had come up with something at a flea market, and some grandmother who said it was a lucky bracelet. Jenna only laughed at her husband's loyalty. But the bracelet stayed with her daughter, and recently Vanessa found it and demanded it. Wendy easily gave it to her. It made me laugh. There it was, the ultimate family heirloom. And now this girl, from whom David, in fact, many years ago took the child, stood before him. What could he say to her? Admittedly, in no way for all these years. Not a living soul has not learned about what happened then in the provincial town. Jacob's father-in-law never doubted for a second that Wendy was his own granddaughter. And what to speak of Irina, who in her daughter does not dote soul. She never found out that she was raising someone else's child, and God never sent them another one. Jenna died in a car accident together with Oleg Pavlovich 10 years ago. It was a real tragedy. David loved his wife very much, and after her death, did not even look at other women. He took on the whole business. After his father-in-law's death, he worked like a cursed man. But he did not forget. Oh, Wendy's daughter. He always thought she was his. That's his daughter. He gave her all his love and tenderness every minute he could with her. The girl was left motherless when she was a teenager. It was hard, of course, but they coped. And now he has the most wonderful daughter. And now he has a granddaughter. They have their own world, their own story. And suddenly there's a woman who can ruin it all. And maybe she's here for a reason. That thought struck David like a bolt of lightning. What does she want? Seems so simple and sweet, really. No, he won't give her his family. I'm sorry, Julia's voice brought him back to reality. You never told me where that bracelet came from. I should probably talk to Wendy. You don't need to talk to Wendy. That bracelet is just a piece of jewelry. I bought it at a flea market. David made an unexpectedly harsh comment. Anyway, I think you should go. Yes, you're right. Julia looked at the man with confusion. His tone discouraged her. Why the sudden steel in his voice? She headed for the door when Vanessa ran up to her, Aunt Julia's bracelet. The girl held out a string of beads. My dear, thank you, but this is a very expensive piece of jewelry. I can't accept it. May you have it for good luck. Julia tried to smile. How can you smile carefree? It's a deal. The lovely Vanessa nodded in response. The nanny came into the room and took care of the girl. How are you leaving already? Wendy exclaimed, when Julia came up to her to say goodbye. Ethan is in the yard building a barbecue. Stay a little longer. No, our guests have to go. She doesn't feel well, answered for Julia David. My driver will take her away. Wendy walked Julia to the car and kissed her goodbye like a best friend. I am very happy to have met such a wonderful person. I'll call you again, and we'll definitely hang out again, Wendy promised. Julia nodded, although there was a doubt in her heart whether David would not interfere with their communication. He was very cold when he said goodbye. And anyway, should she be friends with Wendy? There was a social gulf between them. She drove in the car and wondered why David had suddenly changed so much, how her bracelet could have appeared in their family. It was definitely hers. David said something about the market. But how is that possible? Julia had thrown it away in her town. I mean, you can't imagine going to the dumpster, the landfill, and then the market in Washington. I couldn't believe that a serious man like David would go out and buy junk. I should have asked Wendy. And then the woman remembered the face of her new acquaintance, the blonde hair. And then Wendy shrieked at the sudden thought. She suddenly realized whose eyes resembled the eyes of Wendy and her daughter Mike. Over the years, it was as if his image had twitched, the haze of forgetfulness. And then, just once, the look of his sky blue eyes came back to her mind. Wendy and Vanessa had the exact same look. You're all right. The driver, hearing her scream, turned around normally. It's okay, Julia whispered, clutching her hands together. She thought she'd lost her mind. Some rich man's daughter couldn't be like Mike. But why did they have her bracelet? Once inside the apartment, Julia collapsed on the couch, exhausted. No, she's definitely going crazy. What if Wendy is her daughter? And then her mother lied to her in the hospital, and she gave birth to a girl instead of a boy. Even though her mother convinced her otherwise. And she did, and Julia believed her. But could her mother do that? She may not have loved Julia, but to do such a thing is beyond human comprehension. And it was only in the morning that she fell into a heavy sleep. The sound of the alarm clock literally by the scruff of the neck pulled her out of a painful Viaca dream, where Julia was running somewhere, looking for someone, but who and where she did not understand. At work, Julia was devastated, thoughtfully needed to translate another huge text. But the lines ran away to the side, thoughts were lost. Girlfriend, you had a very good walk yesterday, visibly smiled at Daria, noticing Julia's absent look. How'd it go? Tell me. It was fine. Why don't you tell me how your son did? It was a mess. Our boys blew it. But there will be competitions in their lives. You're right. Julia, what's wrong with you? Molly, I was sitting in a chair. Do you look like you've been run over by a train? Or did you learn a deadly secret? Molly, I think I've lost my mind. And Julia suddenly decided to come clean last night at the mansion. About her thoughts and suspicions later, Molly only shook her head in surprise. I don't know. Strange everything, but unambiguous. You're not crazy. These rich people are hiding something. We should take this David by the throat and let him confess everything. Of course, if your mother was sane, you'd have to talk to her too. Julia suddenly shrieked. When I was in my town, my sister shouted something to me about the child and supposedly asked Mommy, "There you go. Then there's a secret. We must go to your town and ask your sister. That rich guy is hard to get to. It's probably dangerous. But we need to get your sister to talk." Molly. "But if it turns out that Wendy is my daughter, then who did I bury?" "No, I'm going crazy." And Julia was ready to leave for her hometown, when she got a call from the police there. It turned out that Helen had died. So Julia went and paid for the funeral parlor. But she didn't go to the funeral. She had no contact with her sister. It was a pity for her, of course. Juliet even cried, remembering her childhood years. How had everything changed? And then the thoughts took shape. About Wendy once again took hold of her heart. Something had to be done. But what? And then another thought struck Julia. If Wendy really was her daughter, what difference would it make? She wouldn't accept her either. Julia decided she wasn't going to do anything. And then she got a call from Wendy. "Julia, hi. We need to see you urgently in excitement," the young woman said. "Daddy is in the hospital right now with a heart attack." "Oh my God, I'm so sorry." Julia's voice trembled. What happened to him? He confessed to something like that. "Julia, you have to know about this. I'm just shocked. This can't be happening." "But it seems to be true. But it's not a phone call. What time do you get off work?" 6. "I'll be waiting for you at the publisher's." Julia was no longer surprised at anything. Not that Wendy hadn't even asked for the address. Not that the girl had to tell her. Her heart was beating with anxious anticipation. At 6:00 p.m., a silver car was parked outside the publisher's office. Wendy got out of it and walked towards Julia, who was already outside. "Hello." Wendy walked over and held out her hands to her. "I honestly don't know what to call you. My dad said you're my birth mother. I didn't believe him at first, but he told me everything. And that bracelet Vicky has, that's your bracelet. Mine." Julia whispered, barely audibly. "When I saw it, I thought I was going crazy. Daddy said he took it from a trash can near the maternity hospital. It had been thrown away by a young girl whose baby had died. Or rather, she thought it had died. So let's go to the cafe and talk about it." And already in the cafe, they're sitting opposite each other. Wendy told everything her father had told her. Why would he do that? Because he kept it a secret for so many years. When he realized that Juliet is the real mother of Vali, he first began to find out whether the woman appeared in their house so casually. And when he became convinced that Julia is a very decent person, and acquaintance with Wendy is really an accident, he began to suffer remorse. He'd essentially ruined a good person's life. No, Wendy was his favorite daughter and always would be. But how could Julia be left in the dark, especially now that fate had brought mother and daughter together? So he first ventured to speak to his daughter. Wendy, when she found out, she cried for a long time. It turns out that all these years her mother was alive, and she mourned her. No, gentlewoman her was in memory kind, gentle and loving. But her mother was alive, albeit not rich, unsuccessful, but the closest of kin. And then she blamed David. He had bought her as a thing. She had become for him a pledge of his penniless existence. He had separated her from her mother. How could one justify such a thing? In vain, David convinced Wendy that his whole life was her life. But Wendy screamed and screamed. She tried to calm her down. Her husband came running, but the daughter kept blaming her father. And that's when David became ill. He was rushed to the hospital with a heart attack. Wendy became so ashamed and hurt. She had almost ruined with her words a man she loved, even if not by blood, but her daddy was her daddy. David at the hospital got better, and he called Wendy himself and asked her to tell Juliet everything. She must know everything. How do we all communicate? It's up to you, daughter, he said. Decide what? Wendy realized that David would always be her father. Juliet is my daughter, Julia whispered through her tears as she listened to Wendy's confused story. How hard it was for you to know all this. My poor girl, I pity you more. Sobs of wail. For so many years you thought you buried your child. It turns out, I buried David and Jenna's son without. Julia sighed heavily, was quiet for a moment, then added, And you know, Wendy, don't blame the father too much for what happened. He didn't do it all by himself. My mother is more to blame for that story. She, it turns out, convinced him that a newborn girl wasn't necessary for her underage mother. She didn't want me to have the baby in the first place, and then she found the perfect way to get rid of the baby. Sold you. I'll never know why she needed the money. Although I suspect it was for my sister, her husband was trying to build a business. Always needed the money, but it didn't bring them happiness, at least for my sister and my mother too. But we're together now. Wendy smiled and shyly touched Julia's hand. Can I call you Mom? Of course, my daughter. Julia's voice trembled. Tears came to her eyes. She took Wendy's palm in hers, then scooped herself up and moved next to Julia. They hugged tightly and cried. Two soulmates had found each other. It works, Julia said, a little calmer. I have a granddaughter, Vanessa. She's a miracle. You are already a young grandmother, said Wendy, wiping her tears. And her granddaughter wants to hang out with you. Let's go right now. I'd love to, but let's go to David's first. You think I can? But if you don't accuse him of anything. No, I just want to say that I'm grateful to him, Julia smiled. He's given you everything I probably wouldn't have been able to. But that's not even the point. You know what I wanted to name my baby girl? If I had one, Wendy. Oh, really? Wendy laughed. It's in honor of Street Valentine. It's not a Valentine. It's just your great-grandmother had that name. And she was great. She's probably the reason I was able to carry you to term and give birth to you. Can I ask you another question? Wendy was a little hesitant. What was my real father like? His name was Mike. He was a classmate of mine. That's how precocious, young, brave we were. We really loved each other. And if he hadn't died, we would have gotten married. See how fate has turned. And the daughter and her mother hugged each other again. Now they would never separate their father. From the cafe, they drove to the hospital, what Julia and David were talking about. And Wendy did not know. They asked her to step outside. The young woman listened anxiously outside the room, wondering if they were arguing. But no. Soon she heard them laughing and looked into the room in surprise. Daughter, and here I am, Julia, telling what you were as a child. With a smile, said David. Remember how you drew my papers and then proved that it was done by a cat? And when in the 5th grade you were offended by a classmate, how you threw him over yourself. He stayed away from you for the rest of high school. I don't remember how I did it myself. Wendy laughed. Pissed him off. Do you remember the geography test? She flushed the key to the classroom down the toilet. I was so surprised. Geography was your favorite subject. That's because that's when our favorite teacher was fired. So that's how I got justice. Then they brought her back. Julia listened and smiled. Yes, her daughter's behavior reminded Mike at school. Already leaving the room, Julia touched David's hand. You are. She smiled. And you know, I'm not mad at you. We have such a wonderful daughter, the best. Joyfully, he smiled back. And then Julia met her granddaughter. Vanessa was happy to see an aunt she already knew, and could not at first understand why she suddenly became her grandmother. Are there such young grandmothers? Grandmothers with sticks and handkerchiefs. After a week, Wendy finally persuaded Julia to move into their mansion. Arguments that commuting would be inconvenient were immediately dismissed. There's a driver for that. And David asked her to live with them, and Julia had agreed. Now she lived with her daughter, son-in-law, and granddaughter in a luxury house. And to work, she had a private driver. Oh, Molly, I can't believe this is happening. She confessed. Your life's friend could write a novel. Molly agreed, or a fairy tale. Anyway, darling, I'm very happy for you. But I do have one piece of advice. David's already recovered. He's not in the hospital yet. Well, when he comes home, you should look at him. You have a daughter. What do you mean? Julia blushed. That's what I mean. You're only 42 and you can still give birth and have a brother or sister. Oh, what are you talking about? First of all, Mitri and I are so different. And second of all, I'm already a grandmother. It's too late for me to have a baby. Molly only smiled back. Time will tell. And a year later, it turned out exactly as she said, as if prophesied. Julia and David got married. And it doesn't matter that the bride is in her 40s. The groom was almost 50. They realized that they love each other. Moreover, they have a daughter and a son will be born soon. At least, that's what the doctors say.